Okay, so the Iran-Contra scandal is interesting. In fact, I remember it real well. I remember watching the televised hearings for it. And essentially what we were doing was this. We had American hostages in Lebanon. And we were asking the Iranians to negotiate with the people of Lebanon to get these hostages released. Well, in order to do that, we were shipping weapons, missiles to Iran. Well, while we were doing that, what's interesting was the money from the weapons sales we were actually funneling to an anti-communist group in Nicaragua. Now, you may say, well, what's wrong with doing all of these things? Well, the U.S. Congress in 1983 had passed a series of statutes saying that we could not negotiate for hostages, on the one hand, and Reagan made a pledge that we would never negotiate for hostages. And on the other hand, they had also made a statute saying that we would not support regimes, and bless you, we would not support regimes in Latin America that we felt like were against our best interests, right? And it looked like we might be doing this in this case, right? And so when this scandal came to light, Reagan himself is not implicated in it, but Reagan apologizes to the American people for not knowing more about it than what he did. What's really interesting about it is that, think about this for just a moment. We had just had an embarrassing episode in dealing with the Iranian hostage crisis before Reagan gets elected, and it only ends when Reagan's giving his inaugural address. And now we're shipping weapons to the very same people, right, that had been essentially anti-American throughout the 1970s. This was not a very good look for the Reagan administration, and it came to light basically at about the time that Reagan was leaving office. However, Reagan's approval ratings were high enough that his successor, George H.W. Bush, gets elected handily, right? It's Bush that oversees the Gulf War. It's Bush that oversees the conclusion for the Cold War. But it's also Bush who faces a recession in 1991. And interestingly enough, Bush goes against the economic policies of the Reagan administration that I'm going to get to here in a moment, and begins raising taxes on America's top earners. And what's interesting is this. By the end of the 1990s, for the first time since 1836, America is no longer in debt in terms of the federal government. Why? Because Bush basically, in raising taxes, fell on a political sword. In 1992, he's defeated by Bill Clinton, who continues Bush's tax policies that end up erasing the federal deficit by the end of the 20th century, by 1998. However, Bush had campaigned on not raising taxes on any Americans and continuing with Reagan's economic policies that we'll get to here in a moment. And it cost Bush the election in 1992, even though most of us would say that Bush did what? The right thing for the American people and the right thing for the American government. Okay? Which means I need to add something up here to politics under this, under the 1992 to present, right? And I'm going to add this, the contract with America, because it's really important. We'll get to that whenever we get into the next period, right? So let's talk about technology during this period from 1968 to 1992. America goes into what we would call a third industrial revolution. And that revolution is based on the personal computer. In 1977, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak essentially produced what you guys would call a kit, where somebody could build a personal computer in their own home. And they refer to that computer, of course, as the Apple. By 1983, Apple IIes are basically available in classrooms around the United States. Why is this such a revolution? Well, for the obvious reason. As late as 1969, computers were the size of this classroom. 8 years later, the Apple could be put on a desktop about this size. By 1990, we're beginning the process of seeing computers really, at the end of the period, start the process of becoming notebooks or laptops so that people can take them anywhere, right? Eventually, this third industrial revolution gives you the cell phone revolution of today. But during the 1970s and 1980s, personal computing technology was available to people for the first time, just as televisions had been in the 1950s and 1960s. Satellite technology. For the first time, now Americans have cable television. Now Americans have much more media choices than ever before. Now Americans have the ability, for example, to call people around the world easily, right? Satellite technology redefined how Americans would be able to live, and that really gives us the information age that we think of today. All of this occurred during the 1970s and 1980s in its infancy, right? Society. Remember, the civil rights movement shifted dramatically in the 1970s. And women's rights became much more pronounced, and the fight for them became much more pronounced. It became easier to get a divorce. We saw more single-parent households in the 1970s, and families became smaller. We saw efforts in birth control and the Roe versus Wade decision, for example, which gave women more choice in terms of reproductive decision-making than they had ever had before by law. The other thing that we saw, and I think this is interesting too, is we saw an end to interracial marriage by the Supreme Court in 1967. And we also saw something else. We saw a movement for the LGBTQ community that began with the Stonewall riots in 1969, but really steps into the 1970s, because by 1973, for the first time, it's no longer defined as a mental illness to be LGBTQ. Now it is defined more as a social condition and social group. And so what we begin to see, right, is we begin to see another phase of the civil rights movement opening up for another group of people in that movement. The other thing that we saw was Title IX. Roughly about at the same time as the LGBTQ community is beginning the process of creating a movement of their own, in 1972, Title IX began the process of leveling the playing field for girls in public education institutions around the country. What it essentially did was this: any public institution of education, whether that be higher education or that be secondary education in the high schools, or that be, for example, at the junior high or elementary level, what it did was it said that any institution that received federal funding or federal money also had to provide equal opportunities for both boys and girls in the extracurricular programs and also in the academic programs that the campus would offer. Okay? This really opens up the door for more girls to participate in programs within their own school communities. Also, there is a busing crisis throughout the 1970s. One of the issues was, and this was a court case, the Mecklenburg court case in 1971, basically said to achieve a racial balance in American high schools, that you could bus minority students from one part of a community into another. This led to riots in places that we would not expect. Boston, Massachusetts, for example, in 1974, was where some of the ugliest riots related to public busing actually occurred, right? Because it was this idea that you're taking minority students and you're busing them across an urban area into another part of the city where white working class people had lived and traditionally had sent their children to school as well. The busing crisis dies down by the beginning of the 1980s as the Reagan administration really began the process of stepping away from dealing with the issue of civil rights altogether. Being an African American during the Reagan years was interesting at best, not just because there's a step away from civil rights, not just because there's a step away from, and even concerns about the protections in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that are levied during the 1980s. But there's also this concern that the socioeconomic condition of the African American inner city communities is becoming worse throughout the 1980s. And that in large part was due to the economic choices made by the Reagan administration, but by other larger forces that had already been ongoing in the American economy for quite some time. The rise of the American suburb, American factories leaving inner cities and moving into those areas, all of those have contributed to the decay of America's inner cities, which was really prevalent by the 1980s. Now for us, I think it's interesting, right? The last act, I think, of the civil rights movement is actually put forward, in my opinion, actually put forward by the George H.W. Bush administration that occurs during this era. In 1991, he gets passed what is called the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now this meant that you could no longer discriminate against people who of course had physical or mental handicaps in America. And this is where you begin to see parking spaces for handicapped persons in American public places, but you also see accommodations, doors that are more easily opened, for example, in America's public spaces as well, right? Migration. Throughout this period, we saw Asian immigration beginning in the 1970s, particularly after the war in Vietnam and the genocide in Cambodia that lasted from 1975 to 1978, which was a result of the conflict in Vietnam. But we also saw, for example, Asian immigration continuing into the 1980s. This in large part was because of the need for skilled workers and the development of the high-tech industries in places like California, for example, right? That continues throughout the 1970s and 1980s. So does suburban growth, right? And so does the rise of the Sun Belt. And for us, that gives us a couple of concerns here, right? And I did not put environment up here, but I'm going to put that up here right now, right? And I'm going to go ahead and do the environment next, actually. If you would give me just a moment to put that up here, because it's interesting that with the rise of the Sun Belt and the development of the American suburbs during this period and the continued growth of those parts of America's demographic makeup, one of the interesting things that we saw was a renewed interest in a concern for the environment. The Nixon administration creates the EPA. The Nixon administration also creates the Endangered Species Act and the Mammal Protection Acts. And it's really interesting that these come from Nixon because he is a Republican president, right? And I want you to think about this for just a moment. Nixon also has to deal with a divided government with huge Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, right, which are really behind these initiatives as well. And so what's really interesting is that the first Earth Day, the first major protests for the environment occur at the beginning of this period. However, by the end of this period, we see deregulation in the environment. In fact, we see a diminishing role for the EPA during the Reagan years because there was this fear by conservatives that environmental regulations were actually stifling American industrial growth. So in other words, while we saw some efforts to deal with the environment in a very profound way at the beginning of the period, by the end of the period we saw a reversal in some of those policies and the environment not being quite the issue that it had become at the beginning of the period at all, right? In fact, climate change is a major issue today, right? But keep in mind, it was a major issue at the beginning of this period, but by the end of this period, with the fears in the American economy, it sort of becomes a back burner issue, and in some cases, one that has been deregulated by the Reagan administration and George H.W. Bush too, okay? The economy during this period. Americans suffer through the OPEC oil embargo, and Americans suffer through the first major recession since the end of the Great Depression, since the end of the Second World War. And it's safe to say that during the 1970s, there are several reasons for this, right? We actually went over these in class today. outsourcing is one reason. Foreign competition in major American industries, particularly the automobile industry, which had been for Americans, right, a global phenomenon since the 1920s to a large extent, right, and a driver in the American economy, literally, right. The other thing that we saw was automation, right. We saw machines, and by the end of this period, computers that are beginning to replace American skilled workers, right. We also saw as well outsourcing, right? This idea that you could develop a product here in the United States, but you could actually have it made from materials that are cheaper to find and by workers who do not have the same restrictions on their labor and who will work for less, for lower wages, right? So in other words, American companies were seeing that. In essence, I could make my products more cheaply somewhere else, use free trade agreements, ship them here, and then sell them for high prices and make lots of money. The other problem was this. As we saw the rise of the Sun Belt, we saw factories relocating to places where the corporate tax rates were also lowered. And that meant what? Well, that meant that even though there were skilled workers moving into these communities, there was not necessarily the infrastructure, the public school system, the transportation systems, right? There was not an emphasis on building the facilities that would be required, right, for these new industries necessarily in major cities and places like the South, right? And so because you're not able to train these skilled workers, what happens is you ended up bringing skilled workers from other parts of the country. So in essence, these people who were living in parts of the Sun Belt, mostly, for the most part, white unskilled workers or minority unskilled workers are not able to necessarily take advantage of the fact that American factories are moving into areas like this during this period in time, right? And that hurts the economy a great deal, as well as the OPEC oil embargo, right? Happened to hit at roughly the same time in 1973. And of course, the aftershocks of it lasted throughout the decade of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, right? America's dependence on foreign oil becomes a major issue. It also becomes a major foreign policy issue, right? It also is one of the reasons, again, why we're involved in the Gulf War. And later, why we're involved in, and I should put this right here, right, the war on terror too, right? Our involvement in the Middle East, in some measure, has been tied to our involvement and need for sources of petroleum from around the globe, right? I want to look at Reaganomics for just a second because it's really the last piece of the puzzle and then we're done. I think this one's going to end up being more like 45 minutes than 30. That's okay. We could split it in half to some extent. What Reaganomics essentially said was this, and I think this will make some of your eyes roll maybe a little bit, right? But what Reaganomics essentially said was that, and we call it supply side economics, was that deficits didn't matter. In essence, you could cut taxes, you could cut corporate taxes to lure businesses to move to places where you want them to be, right? That's one way of doing that in that process. You could cut taxes, for example, on the wealthiest Americans because you see that they are business owners and so therefore they're going to invest their money in expanding their businesses, therefore hiring more people, right? But while you're cutting those taxes, you're also doing what to bring the Cold War to an end? You're also spending more money on your military, right? So throughout the 1980s, what we saw was two things that happened with Reaganomics. First, American socioeconomic inequality throughout the 1980s grew. That means Americans who had been top earners in the American economy continued to make more money, while Americans who were wage earners continued to make less, or their wages were stagnant. The other thing that we saw beginning with the Reagan years, and really this had begun somewhat in the 1970s, but they really ballooned during the Reagan years, is we began to see the federal deficits begin to grow. And that's because, again, you're not bringing in enough tax money to pay for the military expenses in particular that you were accruing during the Cold War period to try to bring it to an end. We don't see the federal deficit being lowered until, of course, George W. Bush becomes president of the United States, and we see this idea, right, of beginning to deal with deficits by taxing those top earners and therefore bringing the federal deficit under wraps by 1998. But that's for another period. We're done.